This is Ella, and we are here in sunny St. Louis, Missouri, campaigning for Brits abroad.
Welcome to the Liberal Democrats abroad.
We're campaigning for British nationals in Europe and around the world.
Local parties are working much more effectively as Lib Dems abroad.
We're the only party that has representation in Parliament for Brits living abroad.
In the House of Lords, whether you live in Europe or overseas, we'll look after your interests.
We're supporting British and European businesses, working together to overcome the Brexit hurdles they face.
Our scientists and engineers are world class, and we want to see them collaborating with our European friends.
Campaigning for overseas constituencies.
Pensioners abroad have been abandoned with their pensions frozen. We are working to put that right.
There are hundreds of Lib Dem members, supporters and sympathisers. We need to do our best to support them.
Working in hotspots like Afghanistan.
Come to our stand to talk about unlocking the potential of the millions of Britons living abroad who are soon to get the vote again.
Have a great day!
Hi, my name's Elle, I'm Chair of the Young Liberals, and this is what we do.
Good afternoon, conference. Welcome back. I hope you had a good lunch break. We are now moving on to debate item F17, policy motion on Tigray and the Ethiopian civil war. You will find the text of the motion on pages 45 to 47 of your agenda. And Conference Committee has selected 2 drafting amendments to slightly expand on 2 of the points in the motion. And you'll find those on on page 47A of the updated agenda, which you can download from the party website every day. Okay, so would Christopher Johnson from Gwyneth and Anglesey please stand by? And I now call to move the motion Layla Moran, MP for Oxford West and Abingdon and the party's spokesperson on foreign affairs. Layla.
Well, thank you, Duncan, and thank you, Conference. It is with enormous sadness that I move this motion on Tigray and the Ethiopian civil war today. It's a subject that is particularly close to my heart, as I spent part of my childhood living in Ethiopia. We moved there when I was 5 and left when I was 8. And at the time, this is the late 80s, the country was suffering a brutal civil war and a terrible famine. Addis Ababa was full of displaced people and war wounded. And I remember being 6 years old and seeing children my age and just wondering how on earth we lived lives that were just so different. It seems that history is repeating itself. And so, Conference, it is with deep sorrow that we talk today about this humanitarian disaster unfolding in the Tigray region and its surrounding areas. There are conflicting accounts of the origins of the conflict between the European government forces and Tigray's People Liberation Front, but what is not in doubt is the very human, very extraordinary suffering being inflicted by both sides. 4 million people internally displaced, 9 million people in need of desperate help, hospitals without medical supplies, people without food. Ethiopian forces have inflicted a de facto blockade of the region of Tigray with humanitarian aid, including food, fuel and medical supplies, unable to get those in need. The World Health Organization was not permitted to deliver medical supplies from July 21 to this February. And in January, the Red Cross delivered its first shipment of aid since September. The shipment included enough surgical supplies and essential drugs to treat about 200 people. There are an estimated 3.9 million people in Tigray in need of health services and interventions, and a reported 5.6 million in the region in need of food aid and 900,000 in a famine-like situation. But even more harrowing are the accounts of sexual violence. One survivor said, "They raped me, one after the other. I don't know if they realized I was pregnant. I don't know if they realized I was a person." Leading figures in humanitarian agencies have reported that sexual violence is being used as a weapon of war in Ethiopia, soldiers inflicting physical and psychological damage on women and girls in an attempt to undermine the morale of their adversaries. The liberal principles of equality, human rights, peace and democracy, and of course the rule of law, are fundamental to our identity as a party. And wherever these principles are abrogated, whether it be on our doorstep or further afield, it is imperative that we act in concert with international partners to uphold them. So that is why we are bringing this motion to a vote today. It calls on the government to work with international partners, including the UN Security Council and the African Union, to push for negotiations, secure humanitarian access and investigate human rights abuses and war crimes. It is imperative that the international community works to ensure this ethnic violence doesn't spill over into the wider region. Magnitsky sanctions must be used against all who are perpetrators of violence or preventing humanitarian aid from reaching those most in need. And priority in aid efforts must be given to the eradication of sexual violence in conflict. For Conference, you know what would make all of these objectives so much more achievable? If the Conservative government hadn't cut our aid budget. So we stand for restoring the 0.7% of GNI target for international development spending, funding so desperately needed for humanitarian relief, delivered by independent agencies, must be increased. Millions of people are living in a state of acute food insecurity, made worse by the war with Russia and Ukraine because of Russia's exporting of wheat. Internally displaced people and refugees need support as they are forced from their homes by the conflict. The United Kingdom, over decades, had built up a global development superpower. It is an incredible piece in our arsenal in how we deal with countries abroad. We have world-leading institutions that offer research and technical expertise, and this government undermines it. Their misguided decision to slash the aid budget looks even more short-sighted today. From Afghanistan to Tigray, from Syria to Yemen, we cannot break our promise to the world's poorest and most vulnerable. So, conference, I urge you, vote for this motion today. Send a message of solidarity to the people of Ethiopia and Tigray who have suffered so much. And again, let's reiterate our commitment to peace, human rights, and the international rule of law. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Layla. Would David Chalmers from North Devon please stand by? I now call to speak in favour of the motion Christopher Johnson from Gwynedd and Anglesey.
Thank you, Chair. Conference. While the world has rightly been focused on Ukraine and several other things before it, Ethiopia has been raging in war. Ethiopia is a beautiful country with a huge historic Christian and Jewish populations. Indeed, the first convert to Christianity outside Palestine is said to have been an Ethiopian in Acts 8. Even claimed to have the Ark of the Covenant at Our Lady of Mount Zion Cathedral in Axum. Before the war, its economy was heavily based on tourism, both in its historic urban centres such as Axum, as well as in the naturally beautiful highlands. I'm concerned then by the effect this war will be having on local people, not only damaging their livelihoods, but also given the horrendous ways they have been treated, both by the government and the Tigrayan rebels. This motion is important for showing that we care about everyday Ethiopians, many of whom are seeking refuge in surrounding countries such as Sudan. The racial profiling policies of the government are also making it hard for everyday Tigrayans, unconnected from the rebels, from living their lives. Ethiopian Airlines, for example, has put all Tigrayan employees on indefinite leave, as well as refusing to allow ethnic Tigrayans to board aircraft. In addition to this, there is ethnic profiling going on both sides, with the government targeting Tigrayans, as I have mentioned, and the Tigrayan rebels targeting Amarans. This has gotten to the stage where Genocide Watch considers that Ethiopia has simultaneously reached stages 4, dehumanization, 6, polarization, 8, persecution, and 9, extermination on its genocide scale. This is a highly complicated conflict in which both the government and the rebels have committed some pretty horrific deeds, which is why I'm not taking a side in this speech, and why I think it is good this motion does not take sides. What this motion does do is allow us to work with our international partners to seek to find a solution to the ongoing crisis and demand a solution to peace that works for ordinary Ethiopians. That is who we need to be prioritising in all this. Those ordinary Ethiopians who have nothing to do with this war and who want some kind of stability back in their country, to not have to worry about being the victim of war crimes and to be able to rebuild their lives and livelihoods, especially for those who work in the tourism industry, whose livelihood has been decimated as tourists stop coming in. Please vote for this motion.
Thank you very much, Christopher. Would Phil Benyon from Lichfield, Tamworth and Burton please stand by? I now call to speak in favour of the motion David Chalmers from North Devon. And as you probably know, David is also chair of the Liberal Democrat European Group. David.
Thank you. Good afternoon, conference. I echo Layla's sadness at us having to bring this motion, but it is a very important motion that we bring and we debate. I visited Ethiopia just 2 years ago, before the pandemic, and I spent a month there traveling in Tigray, visiting many of the sites that the previous speaker had mentioned. It is quite an amazing, wonderful country. And the sadness for me as well is that I, at that time, they were preparing for elections, which they hoped to be free and fair. And I met with some of our members of our sister party out there, and there was this enthusiasm for the future and how they might be able to better their country and its position. It certainly there was this feeling there, but all the way through there was this feeling of that ethnic issues are prevalent in the country. So political parties, rather than based on values and policies, were often based around ethnic groups. And in Tigray, this was evident while I was there, that the Congress of the Tigrayan political party actually held a Congress in this town that I was there, and were then making it evident that there was going to be problems there. I agree entirely with what Layla has said and what the motion says, that we need to restore 0.7% of GNI, so that the influence of the UK in the aid budget, but also through our sort of diplomatic efforts, can be better and help through the country. We really do need to be working with our international partners to be able to bring influence in Ethiopia. And I'll go back to another point in the motion, that how Brexit has yet again managed to undermine the UK's influence in working with our partners in the EU, elsewhere, but also in the rest of the world, that we haven't got this influence that we had in the past. And certainly, having cut back the aid budget, that has only sort of exacerbated that position. So I think this motion stands for us as a party, for what we stand for freedom, for human rights, and the support of the Tigrayan people. It is right that we are not choosing sides here, but we really do need for the UK to be using its influence and its connections in that part of the world to try to bring about peace, working alongside our international partners. So I urge you to please support this motion. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, David. And we're now moving to the summation speech. So I call to summate on the motion Phil Benyon from Lichfield, Tamworth and Burton, but of course Phil is also chair of the party's Federal International Relations Committee. Phil.
Yeah, thank you, Duncan. And when I visited Ethiopia 3 years ago, what I found was a country full of hope. And it's a country, a very, very young country. They have a quite a serious problem with the population explosion, but the economy was growing, and they were just about keeping up with the economy was just about growing fast enough to keep the young people employed. And as Christopher pointed out, a lot of them, a very large number of highly educated young people working in the tourist industry. So considering the hope, and particularly the hope in terms of support for the changes that Abiy Ahmed was bringing along at that time. And I found that the young people in Tigray were just as strongly supportive of Abiy as the young people in Amhara. So there were at that point, but even then, the youngsters in Tigray were saying that the TPLF old guard really did not like the fact that they had lost power, and this is, I think, the source of the conflict was the TPLF, who had ruled the roost for 20 years since the Mengistu regime was removed, but largely by them, and this opening up and giving power to the other ethnic groups has really irritated the TPLF old guard, but it didn't necessarily irritate the Tigrayan people more generally. And I think what Christopher said about the loss of the tourist economy is really pertinent, because this is causing real suffering. My driver, who was I became quite friendly with, he basically showed up in a refugee camp last autumn, August, September time, and I got a call from him on my mobile phone calling for help. He was in a strange part of the country for him. He was in Bahir Dar, which is not where he's from, and he was in the big refugee camp there, and he said he was starving. In fact, I saw a picture of him, he sent me a picture. He was really emaciated. So I called on another friend who lived in Bahir Dar, said go and find him in the refugee camp, and he did, and he managed to get him out, and we got him fed, and thankfully now he's back to his family and his children back in Lalibela. But this is the sort of real human issues that have been brought up by this really needless conflict. I mean, when we went to Mekele, we found a modern, vibrant, prosperous city. But now it's all lost, really. A lot of this is lost, and we have to try and help rebuild it. We have to find solutions, which is exactly what this motion does. And again, I echo what both David and Christopher have said. We need to work with our allies to help find a solution. And the motion itself is very evenly balanced. We know full well that the TPLF and what has been going on with particularly conflict between Amhara and Tigrayan people that has progressed is absolutely appalling. And the use of sexual violence as a weapon is a war. It is a war crime. It's happening in the Congo. It's happening here. It's a war crime. And the blocking by the government of the aid shipments into Tigray is an abomination. So this is something we have to try and work through. And whether it is fully falls into the realms of genocide is, I think, complex. We have Isaias Afwerki coming in, the autocrat from Eritrea, yet they're ethnic Tigrayans, and they're working on the side of the government. So please support this motion. It's very balanced. It's exactly what we need to be saying, and it does give us a position where we can at least try and push for some help in this area. And thank you. Just please support the motion.
Thank you, Phil. Thank you very much indeed. And thank you to all the speakers. We were able to call everyone who put a card in to speak in that debate. So we're now going to move to the vote. There are no amendments or separate votes or references back. So it's a simple for or against, and you will find the voting instructions in your tab for those of you using computers on the right of your screen. For those of you using tablets, it's in the bar chart icon. So please vote for or against this motion now. Thank you very much, Conference. That motion is very clearly carried by 159 votes to 1 against. So thank you very much, everyone. Thank you to my aides, Beck Scott and Nick DaCosta, and thank you to the technical team who are behind the scenes. We're now going to take a short break before item F18, a Q&A session with Ed Davey. Thanks, everyone.
Hi, this is Cara Jenkinson, and I'm one of the vice chairs of the Liberal Democrat Federal Conference Committee. This autumn, we're really keen to encourage new voices at conference. If you've not spoken at a conference before, now might be the time to give it a go. There'll be debates across a wide range of topics, and we're keen to hear from people who may have direct experience of the issues being debated from their personal lives, or perhaps have professional expertise that they can add. The first step is to look at the conference agenda. Once you've decided on the debate that you would like to contribute to, make sure that you put in a speaker's card by 5 p.m. on the evening before the debate is due to happen. I call it a speaker's card, but actually it's now an electronic form which you can access via the conference website. You'll need to put in a bit of information about yourself, about what you'd like to say and what you'd add to the debate. You'll hear back the evening before the debate if you've been chosen to speak. The conference team will schedule a short technical check and will let you know how to join the debate. We've put together a few short tips on writing a great conference speech. Bex and Duncan are here to share them.
Everyone prepares for a conference speech slightly differently. However, the aim of this is to provide some general tips that can help you however you prepare. Firstly, some people will write out their whole speech and read it off, whereas others will read from bullet points. But regardless of which one of these you use, make sure that any facts you want to quote are accurately written down and clearly marked on your paper, underlined or highlighted if this will help you, because you want to be able to clearly and correctly quote them in your speech in order for them to give the most impact. Secondly, I always make sure I have at least one backup point, because you never know what the speaker before you was going to say. And if their whole speech is focused on one of the points you were going to make, it can be helpful to be not repeating that same point. And finally, 3 minutes isn't as long as you feel it's going to be. So don't try to fit 7 points into a 3-minute speech. You will either end up getting cut off halfway through, or you will be speaking so quickly that no one watching the debate will be able to understand the points you make. Pick the points you feel will fit best into the speech and focus on making them the best speech you can. Best of luck to all of you in your conference speeches in the future.
Hello, my name's Duncan Brack. I've been giving speeches at conference for more years than I care to remember. I've been asked to give you some tips on speaking at conference, so here they are. First, make sure you know how much time you've got. The maximum allowed lengths for speeches are printed in the conference agenda at the end of each motion. They're normally 3 minutes, unless you're giving the opening or closing speeches on motions or amendments. That means you can calculate how many words you can fit into your speech. An average person speaks at about 150 words a minute, but you might well want to go faster than that to give your speech pace and urgency, or sometimes slower, to emphasise your main points. But if you go too fast, your audience might not follow you, and if you go too slow, they might be bored. And if you run over your time, you risk being cut off by the conference chair. Either way, practice your speech in advance, record it and play it back to yourself to check whether it sounds okay and whether it fits into your time. Give a few speeches and you'll find the natural speed that works best for you. Second, write your speech out in the way you like. I write my speeches word for word, which makes it easy to time them, but it does risk making them sound a bit stilted, though I think I can usually avoid that. Many people prefer just writing down headings or brief notes or using cards rather than paper. Whatever you feel most comfortable with will work best for you. Third, be absolutely clear about what you're arguing for and what you want conference to do. If you want them to vote against the motion or for or against a particular bit of it, tell them that right at the start, explain why, and then tell them again at the end. Don't waste time introducing yourself or telling them your life story unless it's directly relevant to your argument. You're there to persuade them to vote the way you want them to, so be as clear as possible about why. Fourth, don't get worried if you get nervous in advance. Everyone does, no matter how experienced they are. Take your nervous energy and put it into your speech. Giving a speech at conference is challenging and nerve-wracking, but it teaches you to focus on what you really believe and what you really think about the motion that's being discussed, and it gives you a real adrenaline buzz. So my final tip is, enjoy yourself.
Hi, my name's Elle, I'm Chair of the Young Liberals, and this is what we do.
This is Ella, and we are here in sunny St. Louis, Missouri, campaigning for Brits abroad.
Welcome to the Liberal Democrats abroad.
We're campaigning for British nationals in Europe and around the world.
Local parties are working much more effectively as Lib Dems abroad.
We're the only party that has representation in Parliament for Brits living abroad.
In the House of Lords, whether you live in Europe or overseas, we'll look after your interests.
We're supporting British and European businesses, working together to overcome the Brexit hurdles they face.
Our scientists and engineers are world class, and we want to see them collaborating with our European friends.
Campaigning for overseas constituencies.
Pensioners abroad have been abandoned with their pensions frozen. We are working to put that right.
There are hundreds of Lib Dem members, supporters and sympathisers. We need to do our best to support them.
Working in hotspots like Afghanistan.
Come to our stand to talk about unlocking the potential of the millions of Britons living abroad who are soon to get the vote again.
Have a great day!
Good afternoon, conference. I'm Cara Jenkinson, and welcome to the Leaders' Question and Answer session with Sir Ed Davey.
So I've received a lot of questions, and unfortunately, I'm probably not going to be able to take them all. In terms of how this is going to run, I'll ask the question on behalf of the questioner. Ed will answer it, and then I'll ask the questioner if they have a supplementary. And I may also take a question from the online audience. Do put your question in the Q&A tab and not in the chat, which is likely to be fairly busy. So please do use the Q&A function. So I will move to the first question, and that is from Adam Robertson. So Ed, how does the democratic world espouse and promote its values in an increasingly ideological fissure between the democratic states and authoritarian states?
Well, good afternoon, conference, and thank you for that question, Adam. I'm sure at the back of your mind is what's happening in Ukraine, which has moved us all. The shocking invasion by Putin's regime, and then the distressing images we've seen of people being attacked, bodies, the refugees. It is one of the most distressing periods in my lifetime, and I think it is making people rethink about how we should respond. I've been privileged to talk to a number of Ukrainian Liberals. We joined a group of European Liberal leaders recently on a call for ALDE, talked to representatives of President Zelensky's party, who's now joined ALDE, but also a lady who you'll hear from tomorrow, Kira Riddick, who's the leader of Holos party, another Liberal party in Ukraine. And listening to them talk about their stories and how challenging it is really humbles you. I'm hoping next week to go to the Ukrainian border to meet some of the refugees as part of our campaign, the Liberal Democrat campaign, to get the government to do far more for Ukrainian refugees. So this whole episode, whether it's humanitarian side or the security side, has, I think, been a wake-up call. I've said in the House that I think the West has been way too complacent for far too long. And we've seen the fragile alliances and partnerships which are fundamental to a liberal world order. We've seen them taken for granted. We've seen them undermined. Obviously, Brexit is a big example of that. People don't value the peace that the European Union has been such a great part of. President Trump's undermining of NATO, I think that was just appalling. And he should bear a heavy price for that undermining of our collective defence. He also tried to undermine the World Health Organization. These organizations were sort of put in place when people realized the importance of this multilateral world where nations came together to work together, which is such a fundamental part of liberalism and what we espouse. And it's been deeply depressing to see it taken for granted. And when you think of some of the threats to human rights posed by China, whether it's what we've seen in Hong Kong, whether it's the Uyghur Muslims, you see what happens when we don't uphold that world order, that liberal world order. And so I think we've got to use this in a way as that wake-up call to rebuild the West's and beyond the West's commitment to working together. We really have got to make our case as strong as possible on the back of this. The costs of turning our back on that world order are so huge. The democracy, the freedom, the peace that we have enjoyed is at threat if we don't. So, Adam, you're absolutely right to focus on this.
Thanks very much, Ed. And could I ask, Adam, do you have a supplementary question?
Yes. Thank you, Ed, for answering that clearly. My big concern is obviously China have got the Beijing consensus and the economic model, what they're doing for their road and bolt initiative within the global south. How do we challenge that and sort of provide for a new liberal Washington consensus? Because it seems like the old Washington consensus economic model has sort of been put to one side, and a lot of the African states are looking towards China. How do we pivot back for them to come towards democratic states as way of life as such?
Well, first of all, we've got to defend and rediscover the value of what we have enjoyed. I particularly think about our relationship with our European neighbours, particularly on trade, but way beyond that as well. We've got to value those close ties that have been developed over so long. And, I'm really proud that the party passed earlier today this very practical but also idealistic paper on Europe, so we can build back those relationships, build back that trust. That is a key part, Adam, of responding to what we're seeing from China and elsewhere. I think China poses a whole set of problems, and the only way we are going to deal with them in a peaceful, secure way is by going back to those multilateral institutions I talked about. I could have mentioned the World Trade Organization. That effectively broke down after the Doha round of trade talks because of that clash between China and the United States. The United States insisting that China was seen as a developed country and China insisting it was seen as a developing country. We've got to try to get those two countries in the right place, and that's where, for example, a strong Europe plays such a role. So it's part of what I said before, Adam, really looking at those multilateral institutions that were built up, which were part of that liberal world order. We may need to strengthen them in different ways, we may need to reform them in different ways, but they are the building block, and we have to be far more watchful of them and far more committed to them, which we've just not seen from the UK government, from the Trump government, and from others, I'm afraid. I would say this as well, and given what's happening in Ukraine, I think this may worry some people, but we've got to face up to it. One of the concerns that many of us had for a number of years is President Xi's desire to bring Taiwan back into mainland China by force if necessary. And we have to debate in our party and across the UK and with our partners how we prevent that happening. There is a democracy on the island of Taiwan, and it would be outrageous if China took Taiwan by force. So that's just another example. You quoted a good economic example, but another example of how we have to work together as nations, and why Liberal Democrats have so much to add to that debate as having been the champions of that in our country.
Thank you very much, Ed. So I've got another question from the online audience, specifically Ross Pepper, who asks, can we look at pushing a policy for refugees for all seeking sanctuary from war?
Straight answer is yes. We have argued for a more generous approach at every stage when there have been refugees coming, whether it's been from Syria, Afghanistan, now Ukraine, or indeed other areas. We've pushed forward the idea of humanitarian visa, which takes away the bureaucracy and delays and gives people the chance to come here. We've argued for safe routes to resettle refugees, something that Priti Patel and the Conservatives have refused to do. They've made it almost impossible for people to come to this country. In the current bill before Parliament, the Nationality and Borders Bill would actually make it illegal for a Ukrainian refugee to come to the UK. That's how shocking the Conservatives are, and how much we have got to fight for an approach which treats human beings as precious and cares for them wherever they come from. We have to be the party advocating for humanitarian response.
Thank you very much, Ed. So we're now going to move on to a question from Catherine Pinder. In view of the rapidly increasing poverty and inequality in our country now, will you commit to making ending poverty your first concern this year?
Well, Catherine, I think we're already trying to do just that. And it's because there is a cost of living crisis that's been gathering as a storm in the last year, with the rising cost of energy in particular, but also food bills and other things that are basic for families and people. And that crisis, I think, has become an emergency with the impact and effects of Putin's invasion of Ukraine. We've seen that particularly in oil and gas prices, but we will see that in food prices and no doubt other commodities too. And that will create a human crisis across the world, but also particularly hitting more vulnerable and lower and even middle incomes people in our country. I had an email from a constituent just last week, and it really stuck in my mind. It was a disabled lady, a single parent. She had 3 children, one with special education needs, and she was talking about how already the rising costs for her have meant that she basically moves her family into one room. They share one light. They've moved one heater in there. That she's rationing the time that her children can go on the internet. And she's also was saying, and this really struck with me, that she's told her children not to put their clothes to be washed unless they're really smelly. Now, that sort of thing is happening in my constituency, which is largely seen as a relatively prosperous area compared to many, but we have pockets of deprivation, and we have individuals and families, far too many of them, who are really struggling. And so this issue of tackling poverty, of trying to reduce inequality in our country is a fundamental one, and it's probably never been more urgent given what we're seeing with the cost of living crisis. And it's one of the reasons why I put forward the idea of a Robin Hood tax, a windfall tax on oil and gas companies. And we, in Liberal Democrats, we led that debate. Labour took the idea up. I was pleased to see them follow us. But we put the idea forward of a windfall tax on oil and gas companies because they are making super profits, huge profits, unexpected profits because of the rise in oil and gas prices. They can afford to pay more into the pot. So the government can then pass that out to people who are struggling, like my constituent. It's the reason why we've talked about the need to improve universal credit, not just reversing the cuts the Conservatives have made to them, but improving it. Our party policy, for example, because we're worried about children in poverty, says that universal credit and child premiums in universal credit shouldn't just be for your first 2 children, but for your 3rd or 4th or 5th children if you have a larger family. And the failure of the universal credit to do that is one of the reasons why we've seen a big increase in child poverty. We've also argued for a big increase in what's called the warm home discount and increasing the number of people who can get it, to take in all people on universal credit and a number of other income-related credits, benefits. Warm home discount, for those of you who don't know, is a money that comes straight off someone's energy bill. It's currently 140 quid a year. We think it should be at least 300, and that would help about 7.5 million people. When we think about pensioners, we've got to really worry about a number of, particularly the poorest pensioners, and sometimes, because that can be quite difficult, we've actually called in the short term for a doubling of the winter fuel allowance as a way of making sure we're helping pensioners too. So we've got to think about everyone in our society who's really struggling, who's going to be hit particularly hard by this cost of living crisis. And I hope we as a party can campaign on the cost of living crisis and get forward our policies which would really help the most vulnerable in our society.
Thanks very much, Ed. Catherine, do you have a supplementary question? Catherine, I think you may be muted.
Go again, speak.
Am I heard now? No?
You are.
Yes, she said.
Yes.
You can hear me. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yes.
Thank you, Ed. I would like to ask, please, would you expect that our 2019 commitments in the manifesto will be observed in the next manifesto, as well as subsequent commitments from our September conference? And may I ask also how you would expect a windfall tax, how this could be used to actually reduce the costs of ordinary people who are falling into poverty? Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Catherine. I was really proud of our 2019 manifesto. It was independently assessed by the Institute of Fiscal Studies as being the most progressive because we were helping the most vulnerable and the poorest in our society more than other parties, including the Labour Party. And I think we should stand by that commitment to be the most progressive party in British politics. Clearly, the manifesto, how it will exactly look, the exact details, can't quite say yet, but that objective of being the party of social justice has to be there, and I'm sure the party will want to put that there, certainly would have my total support. In terms of the Robin Hood tax, how that helps, in and of itself, it doesn't help. It's taking money from the oil and gas companies, but we're going to use that money that we take from the oil and gas companies to pay for the extra benefits, the cut to the national insurance contributions and so on. We have a package of measures to help the low paid, to help families in poverty, to help pensioners, and that I think is the right approach. You do sometimes have to find the money to pay for that, and although it seems that Rishi Sunak is prepared to borrow, you can do some by borrowing, but I do think it's irresponsible to show that you are prepared to put up taxes where necessary. And this proposed tax, this Robin Hood tax on the oil and gas companies, I think is a fair way. I think we're a party of fair taxes, taxing those who can afford to pay, like the oil and gas companies with their oil and gas profit bonanza, and reducing taxes on low-paid workers and indeed increasing benefits. I think that is an approach which speaks to our values, our principles on social justice.
Thank you very much, Ed. Right, we're now going to move on to a question from Matt McLaren, and that is, what do you think could be the long-term impact on British politics or standards in UK public life if Boris Johnson remains in office?
Well, Matt, thank you for that question. And I heard your speech yesterday in the debate, really great. And the fact you linked the need to think about this in terms of local government as well, I think was absolutely right. We need to make sure that our politics is one that people want to be part of. I have to say, I think Boris Johnson has really damaged British politics already. And I think the Tory party have assisted him. I mean, yes, Boris Johnson is the leader of the pack, but the fact that Tory MPs have failed to remove him, they make them complicit in the damage he's doing to our politics. And let's be clear, I've made no secret of this. I've never thought Boris Johnson was fit to be Prime Minister. As a London MP, I saw him at action as the Mayor of London and was deeply unimpressed and actually alarmed how he wasted money and was not trying to bring our capital together. And he's totally failed, in my view, as Prime Minister. And it's not just he's incompetent, which he clearly is, never on top of his brief, but he doesn't have the right values, and the way he's behaved over the COVID rules is quite shocking. The fact that he has broken those rules so clearly and refuses to admit it, the fact that he's the first serving Prime Minister ever to be investigated and interviewed under caution by the police, I think that speaks volumes. But he's not only a lawbreaker, he lies on an industrial scale. I mean, it's just deeply frustrating. You may share my frustration, Matt, that in Parliament he comes at PMQs, Prime Minister's questions, and he just lies the whole time. It's one of the reasons. I mean, I don't know if you know, but in the House of Commons, you're not allowed to accuse another MP of lying. You get called up by the chair and thrown out if you won't remove your accusation that someone's lied. We tabled an amendment to standing orders to try to change that for the Prime Minister. It didn't get debated, regrettably, but we were trying to make the point that we have a Prime Minister who just lies. And that is so undermining of democracy. If you're going to have a decent debate, if you're going to be able to show the British public there's one argument here, another argument there, you've got to do it from a shared set of facts. And when the Prime Minister just continually misleads, I think intentionally, and fails to tell the truth, it just prevents that and gets in the way. And so we've got to find a way to rebuild back trust in British politics. That starts with him going. He should resign. Now, I've been asked since the Russians invaded Ukraine whether my consistent call for the Prime Minister to go, whether I have suspended that. Let me tell you, I have not. He should go. And in World War II, when our troops were in action, Parliament got rid of the Prime Minister, Neville Chamberlain, and replaced him with Churchill. And, isn't it a joke that our Prime Minister pretends to be almost like Churchill? He's the reverse. He's weak and he lies. He should go, and that would actually strengthen our Parliament. It would strengthen our government and strengthen our international response to work with our partners in the United States, in Europe and beyond. So I stick by my view that he should go, both to see through these serious challenges we have. Still got COVID, the security issue in Ukraine and Russia, and of course the cost of living emergency. We need someone different. He should go. And Liberal Democrats have got to be part of that, building that pressure. I was so proud of what we did collectively in North Shropshire, and huge thanks to all of you who were part of that. Although at the beginning of North Shropshire, Partygate wasn't known, we hadn't heard the revelations, and people were critical of Boris Johnson and the Tories more generally for taking them granted on things like the health service and so on. At the end of that campaign, Partygate was in the news, and you heard lifelong Conservatives absolutely anti-Boris Johnson, indeed increasingly anti the Conservative Party. So if we're going to rebuild the trust in British politics, Boris Johnson has to go, and we have to do a North Shropshire time and time again.
Thanks very much, Ed. Matt, would you have a supplementary question?
Yes, thank you, Ed, for that comprehensive answer, and I'm really pleased to hear you say again that you still want Boris Johnson to go, because he absolutely must. I suppose my supplementary, you've sort of half answered it there in your last point. It's just, what more can we as Liberal Democrats do to pile on the pressure and to make sure that this is still, despite the other very important and quite frankly scary things going on in the world, to make sure that this is still a concern in the mind of voters, so that basically he's not let off the hook for what is, quite frankly, a scandalous abuse of power and abuse of office, in my opinion.
Well, the best thing you can do in the next few days and weeks is get out there and campaign for the local elections. Let us beat as many Conservative councillors and candidates this coming May. Let's give the Tories a bloody nose wherever we can and send a message and say to people that they can send a message, they can restore decency in our politics by defeating every single Conservative candidate where we're contesting. So please, I think that's the first thing, to pile on the pressure. And although inevitably and rightly, Ukraine is dominating our thoughts, whether it's what's happening in Ukraine itself or the refugees, I don't think Partygate has really gone away. It will return. I think it's cut through to many people. They've lost total trust in Boris Johnson. So let us pile that pressure on, both in Parliament but also at the ballot box in May's elections.
Thanks very much, Ed. So the next question is a fairly simple one from Joe Otten. Are we ready for the next pandemic?
Joe, thank you for that question. No, but to be absolutely explicit, the UK is not ready for the next pandemic. But let me say a little bit more. I mean, first, I don't think the current pandemic's finished. I don't know if you've seen the recent figures, the number of infections, the number of hospitalizations, the number of deaths in recent days is going all the wrong way. And I fear there's a bit of complacency about the current pandemic. You don't have to believe me if you believe the spokespeople from the World Health Organization and a number of senior medical people in the UK. They're pretty worried that Boris Johnson's government is being way too complacent. And I want to pay tribute to my Liberal Democrat parliamentary colleagues here, Daisy Cooper, Layla Moran, and the whole team actually, who are trying to hold the government to account, and in the House of Lords with Sal Brinton and others. We really are trying to hold the government to account for the way they're failing on the current pandemic. But you're right, you talked about the future. As you know, I led the charge for a public inquiry, and the reason for that was so that we could learn the lessons from the current pandemic, so we would be ready for the next pandemic. And I'm angry, and I think it's a dereliction of duty. I think it's negligence on behalf of the government that while they eventually got round to setting up the public inquiry, it won't take hearings till next year. I mean, you can see what they're doing, can't you? As we indeed predicted, they are trying to delay and delay to save their political skins when the country needs to learn the lessons now. The government was so badly prepared when the pandemic broke out. It had ignored reports that had been written after a simulation exercise of a pandemic back in 2016, 2017, I think it was, and they didn't learn the lessons. The public inquiry will obviously be a rather bigger affair. They have to do that as soon as possible. They have to learn the lessons. Those lessons apply in so many areas. They particularly apply in the health service, of course. Previously, they had been told, guess what? To get more PPE, to have more ventilators, to have more critical care beds. That's what they were told before COVID, and they failed. I sort of feel they won't do that, even now. Their failure to invest in the NHS over years, I think, is a real problem. I think if we do get to this inquiry and we think about preparing for the next pandemic, clearly we've got to invest even more in our sciences, our biosciences, and the amazing people who came up with the vaccine, doing that collaboratively with other countries. But we also, and I feel passionately about this, we've got to make sure that we think about our children and young people more. One of probably the biggest cost from this pandemic and the way the government mishandled it. Yeah, they wasted money on loans that were abused, PPE that was unusable. They've wasted lots of money like that, as we all know. But by failing to support our schools and our children, our young people, they've put a heavy cost on our society and our country now and in the future. And their failure to listen to their own advisor, their own specialist on COVID catch-up, I think is one of the worst things that I've seen from this government. And we can't let them get away with it. They were told they needed to invest £15 billion for our children to catch up. They've given less than a third of that. And I was really pleased to see that Manira's and the education team's motion was put to conference today and passed very, very strongly, because it talks to our campaign that we need to support our children and young people. So, long answer, Joe, but the short answer is no, we're not ready. We need to learn the lessons, and we need to learn them fast.
Thank you very much, Ed. So, Joe, do you have a supplementary question?
Yes. Thank you so much for the answer, Ed. I entirely agree, and I look forward to the inquiry. I hope it is really comprehensive. I suppose the one thing is that we don't know that the next pandemic will be similar to the last one. It may be different. It may be a bacterium. It may spread in different ways, etc., etc. It struck me this time how much we depend on so many millions of people who work in jobs that have to be done face to face, that whether it's transport or the food supply chain or whatever it is. And we didn't really have an alternative. We weren't ready. We couldn't say, well, look, here's another way we could have this work done that we all rely on. And so millions of people basically had to take it on the chin. And I wonder if that's something we could think about before next time. And then the other thing, the last thing is, so many people were basically told to be entirely alone for months on end. And that was so hard. And is there a way to be fairer to people who happen to live on their own already compared to people who in large households had kind of lots of company on hand? Those are the two things I want us to take away.
Joe, brilliant points. I hope the inquiry will cover all those aspects too, those social aspects, the fact that we relied on what we all got to know as key workers. Initially, people thought that was just the NHS, brilliant though that they are, but it's also care workers, but also people in our supermarkets, in our food shops, bus drivers, so many people who were having to work throughout, many people on low wages, let's remember, but putting their lives on the line to make sure our communities and our societies continue to function. And you're absolutely right. That's one of the key lessons. We need to think through ways. I don't have the answers, but I think in terms of one of the issues that needs to be addressed in inquiry and in preparations for, in case there is another pandemic, that's exactly right. Your point on loneliness, I think, is really well made too. I don't know about you. I was delighted and really proud of the party that we did so many phone calls, phoning vulnerable people and people who are on their own. Many local parties took part in that community action, and we played, a small role, but we reached out and did what we could to try to help people who were lonely and alone in practical ways, as well as just talking to people. But we've got to do more of that. I mean, clearly one of the most distressing things was residents at care homes when they couldn't see their family. And there's quite well documented now that people who are suffering from dementia, the dementia got far, far worse because they didn't understand why their families weren't visiting them. Because people forget that dementia doesn't mean the person doesn't actually understand and recognise it. They just threw it through a mist. And it was really sad to hear so many stories of elderly people's health deteriorating. And I think that loneliness point you make has to be taken on, whether it's the care homes, whether it's on people who have to self-isolate by themselves because they are clinically vulnerable. We've got to think of better ways, and there must be a lot of learnings that we could take from people's experiences in communities up and down our country.
Thanks very much, Ed. So I'm going to move to the next question, and that's a question from Daniel Mermelstein. It's a little bit long, I'm going to read it out. So Daniel says, Ed, I joined the Lib Dems the day after it made UBI party policy. I had never been a member of a political party before. Would you like to see UBI introduced in the next Parliament, and will it be front and centre of the next Lib Dem general election campaign?
Well, first of all, welcome to the party. I'm delighted you joined, and thank you very much for that question. Let me start by saying our approach on social justice has, throughout our history, been a party that innovates in policies and policy ideas. And we've got a really proud record where we focus on social justice. It's like a golden thread, often forgotten, and the other parties don't want you to remember it, but never forget, from Lord George and the state pension and minimum wages, through to beverage and the welfare state, I think through to things that Liberal Democrats have achieved at local government level and national government level. Examples like the work that we did on mental health, the work we did on pupil premium. I think we have a proud record of being innovators and thinkers and pushing the envelope out to make sure we're looking after people who are the most vulnerable in society. As you know, the UBI proposal is now with a working group, Fair Society. I'm really excited about the work that they're doing on that policy. And to give an outrageous plug, there is a consultation session for the Fair Society Working Group, I think almost directly after this Q&A. So do contribute to that. As a member of the party, it would be great for you to get involved in that. And that's one of the things that differentiates our party from others, that members who've joined because of a policy idea can get involved in developing it and making sure it lives up to our hopes and aspirations. And, let's see what comes out of that working group, what they conclude on the UBI. I think it will be tackling lots of different issues. And I'm particularly concerned, and this really comes from my constituency work, about how we address through our policies the most vulnerable. And I'm talking about people whose lives can be very chaotic, for whom the other parties often aren't interested. So homeless people, I've done some work on homeless people who are terminally ill, who the current law shuts out. That's outrageous. How are we going to make sure that our policies on benefits and finance reaches those people who, young people who have left home and are in transit all the time, people escaping domestic abuse, people who've got drug and alcohol problems. We need to make sure, as we design these policies, and that's what I'm looking to the Fair Society Working Group to do in consultation session later on, to make sure that we are getting them right for the most vulnerable, so we can be proud and continue the record of being the most progressive party. Just one example before I end. I've always been cognizant of some of the people I've talked about who are at the margins, who policymakers always overlook. How often they're unable to get payments because they don't have bank accounts. And that sounds a really boring thing, but the working group, the Fair Society Working Group, is looking at those sorts of details. And I think that's exactly what we should do if we're going to be able to look people in the eye at the next election and say, yeah, we've got the best policies, the most progressive policies that will reach the poorest in our society. We've got to get it right, and the Fair Society Working Group is working on that.
Thanks very much, Ed. And Daniel, do you have a supplementary question at all?
Sure, thanks. Thanks, Ed, for your answer. And I am going to be attending that working group. I'm looking forward to it. You mentioned a lot of situations that people find themselves in, and different groups of people, and people like us who believe in basic income think that UBI is at least part of the answer to a lot of those questions. I guess what I wanted to know from you is whether you think that as well. Do you think UBI is part of the answer to those questions?
Well, I've always thought that we need to improve the benefit system, and the sorts of models that we're talking about now, that UBI speaks to, is absolutely a critical way forward. So what I hope, and you'll see at the consultation, I hope and be able to contribute, I hope that will be designed in a way which will truly reach out to those vulnerable groups. Because that's the test, isn't it? The test of our policies, whether it's UBI or anything else, is do we make sure that we are the party that speaks to the most vulnerable, the poorest, whatever their life is at that particular moment. It's one of the reasons I mentioned earlier on in an answer, I think it was Catherine Pinder, one of our universal credit reforms we talked about the last election was making sure that the third or fourth or fifth child had a UC child premium. And it was one of those policies that I think, if you look at the different analysis that the IFS and others did, that made us the most progressive party. And so sometimes the devil is in the detail. That's why I'm delighted to see the Fair Society Working Group getting to grips with the details. And I just point out that, as I did a few minutes ago, ensuring that the money will go to people, whatever their state of life, is actually a key test. And that's why, whether it's bank accounts or something from the local post office, I don't know, we need to make sure that we can be sure that the systems we come up with really gets to the most vulnerable.
Thanks very much, Ed. So move now on to a question from Duncan Brack, who asks, would you be open to talks with other opposition parties to explore areas of possible agreement, like the Cook-McLennan talks between Labour and the Lib Dems in the 1990s? And for those of you that aren't as knowledgeable about Lib Dem history as Duncan Brack is, that was around finding common ground on constitutional reform.
Well, thank you very much, Duncan, for that question. You'll know better than almost anyone else that it's a key part of the Liberal Democrat approach that we're prepared to work with all parties when we have mutual interests, shared values and shared policy priorities. Liberal Democrats do that in local government all over the country. So it should be no surprise. And let me point to one recent campaign success that Liberal Democrats had, Layla Moran's fantastic success to scrap the Vagrancy Act. Layla's always made clear that she was working cross-party to do that. And she has pointed out very, very wisely that in getting that over the line, she managed to do that by working with Conservatives. And so it really is important, whatever we're looking at, that we try to work cross-party, because you can get much more sustainable change. But you, quite rightly, Duncan, focus on political and constitutional reform. We have a very ambitious agenda in the party, as you know. Electoral reform, top of the list. We need PR if we're going to restore trust and faith in British politics and give power to people at the ballot box. Fair votes is the only way you can do it. So that's top of our list, of course. But we've got Lords reform. We've also got to defend what we've achieved, because there are people on the right who want to take away things like the Human Rights Act, who want to undermine the European Convention on Human Rights. Even before Parliament at the moment, things are getting worse if we're not careful. The Elections Bill requiring voter ID is a real threat. So we've got to push our agenda of electoral reform and so on, and defend what's so vital to a healthy democracy that we already have. And if you look about Cook McClellan, you're right to focus on the talks that Bob McClellan for the Liberal Democrats, our late dear friend Bob, had with the late Robin Cook. Those talks came actually out of years of work, and most significantly, how Labour itself changed. Labour had been very anti some of those reforms, and the reforms that happened, to remind people, are devolution, Scotland and Wales, that came out of those talks and that movement, PR for European elections, Free Information Act, the Human Rights Act itself. That came out of a long period of engagement, but particularly with Labour reassessing internally its position. So to answer, I guess, your question, but I wanted to just put some of our values up front to make it clear that I'm up for working when we share mutual interests. The problem I see at the moment is Labour is not there yet. In the way that Robin Cook and Tony Blair had taken the Labour Party quite a long way, I don't quite see that yet in the Labour Party. There's some movements at constituency Labour Party level, which are really welcome, but I don't think in my conversations that Labour's moved anywhere near far enough. And all I would say is, we're, of course, trying to influence people, but we all, every Liberal Democrat, collectively, I think it should be one of our shared priorities to persuade Labour colleagues and colleagues in other parties that electoral reform and political reform is essential if we're going to rebuild and improve our democracy and regain the trust that the Tories in particular have so damaged.
Thanks very much, Ed. And can I ask Duncan if you have a supplementary?
Yes, thanks very much, Ed. I think it was a very good answer. I was struck by the fact that discussions on progressive alliances always focus on things like withdrawing candidates or encouraging tactical voting. But the other element of them is the benefit of trying to reach a common agenda with opposition parties on a few key topics that makes the government increasingly seem like they're the minority. They're out of touch with what other people are saying. And I just think, I entirely accept what you say about Labour and Starmer and the sluggishness with which they're moving, but given what the government has done to undermine democracy in this country, it seems to me there is a good case for trying to reach agreement, and perhaps this is something that the Liberal Democrats could propose, trying to reach agreement with Labour and other opposition parties on the basic rules of the game, how politics and government are conducted in this country, how democracy and the rule of law are defended. That seems to me to be a prize worth trying to grasp.
Oh, I could not agree more. We absolutely need to put pressure and also reach out to others who are willing to go on the journey that we know is so essential for our country. I guess the challenge is when they seem reluctant. I mean, let's remember, the Labour Party conference last autumn voted down a proposal for proportional representation, for electoral reform. And that was deeply disappointing. And I was not just disappointed, I was quite angry, actually, because it did look like there was some movement. So I agree with you, we've got to reach out, but you do need someone on the other side willing to talk to you. I mean, there are, of course, other areas where we can look. I mean, climate change is such a critical area. We need to work with other parties on that because there are some very long-term reforms that are needed. We need to vastly accelerate what we're doing if we're going to be anywhere near the position we can deliver on net zero. And there are other areas I would actually like to see a bit more cross-party work on care reform and social care, because the Conservatives' proposals are just shockingly poor. If we're going to get the socially just country we want, we've got to look at how we tackle the challenges that are quite different, actually, in the 2020s from where they were 30, 40 years ago. So on all those spaces, whether it's political and constitutional reform, whether it's climate change, whether it's social justice agenda, you could add in technology and the rise of China that we were talking about earlier, we do need to try to persuade other people that there are some overlaps, whilst of course retaining a pretty distinctive liberal position.
Thanks very much, Ed. And I just wanted to ask another question that's come in through from the online audience, which is in relation to what can be done to highlight and tackle Russian influence over the Conservative Party and Tory politicians.
Well, great question. We've actually been on this for quite some time before Putin's invasion of Ukraine, and Leila Moran in the House of Commons has tabled and put forward a bill to try to ensure that where there was a beneficial interest in a company or in a property that was being hidden by some sort of shell company, that would be more transparent on a register. So we led that even before the invasion of Ukraine. Indeed, in the House of Lords, Susan Kramer put an amendment down with respect to the Freeport policies to make sure that there was transparency there. There's always a bit of worry that there's a lack of transparency around Freeports, and there's been quite a lot of Russian interests in Freeports in other countries. So we've already been onto this. We need obviously to do more, and in many ways the shocking attack on Ukraine has highlighted this issue. And I've also been appalled by how slow Johnson's government has been sanctioning Putin's cronies. You just look at the figures. The United States has sanctioned, I think, nearly 200 more of Putin's cronies than we have. The European Union has sanctioned nearly 500 more. Don't believe anything Johnson says. That won't come as a surprise to the Liberal Democrat audience. But, they are weak on sanctions, and I think alarmingly weak. And I think, London is not seen in a good light, whether it's from Washington or other capitals. They're really poor. And, what I have said publicly on your Pacific issue is I think there should be a full investigation into Russian influence on British politics and their finance in our country after the crisis has been dealt with, hopefully as soon as we possibly can. But we must hold the Conservative Party to account, and we've started that process. We must continue it.
Thanks very much. And we probably have time just for this as a final question, which is, what are your views on calls for more fossil fuels, fracking, and rolling back net zero by the right wing of the Tory party, and including MPs?
I am totally against it, and so should all Liberal Democrats. We are hearing some nonsense from what used to be called climate change deniers, who are really now climate change delayers. They're trying to put obstacles in the way. And they are, I think, outrageously trying to abuse this situation to push their agenda of fracking and of nuclear power and so on. We should utterly reject it. In rejecting it, we've got two things I really want to draw to your attention because these arguments are not often heard. First of all, the idea that fracking and nuclear power is the answer to the problems we've got now is nonsense. They would take 10 years or more to provide any gas or electricity from those routes. They're completely irrelevant to the crisis we have at the moment. And this idea that if you produce loads more gas in the UK, that would bring the price down is a total nonsense. At the height of gas production from the North Sea, Britain didn't set the price. We took the price. We were a price taker from European and international markets. So the rights arguments here are wrong. We should reject them. While in the very, very short term, there may be a case for importing more gas from North America in our what are called liquid natural gas terminals, LNG terminals, in the very short term, using existing oil and gas production, the real way forward is renewables, is energy efficiency, is insulating people's homes. And here's the point. Action on climate change is just the flip side of the coin for energy security. If you want to make any country more independent and less dependent on the imports of fossil fuels from countries like Russia, the way to do it is to invest in renewable energy, renewable heat, renewable power, and invest in insulation, more efficient buildings. That is, without doubt, the best way to do it. This response of the right has frankly infuriated me, and it shows how the Conservative Party is still very divided on this issue, and we should be the ones sticking to our guns.
Thanks very much, Ed. There is a follow-on question from the chat, which is, should we be advocating for nuclear energy for our midterm energy needs?
Well, my approach on nuclear has always been about whether or not it's the affordable source of low-carbon power that we need. And the truth is it's extremely expensive. When I was dealing with these matters in office, my task was to bring the costs of all low-carbon forms of power and heat down. We worked really hard on all of it. The one that came down the most, the fastest, is renewables. Wind power, offshore wind, onshore wind, solar power. We got those costs down dramatically. And I'm really proud it was Liberal Democrats, you, me, the party, we delivered on cheap, green, clean power. We should be really proud of that. You should be really proud of that. And what that has meant is the case for nuclear has been dramatically undermined, I'm afraid. Nuclear remains very, very expensive. Am I against research and development to see if that could be changed? No. I'm not an ideological on the issue, but I look at the facts in front of me, and the facts are really clear. If you want an affordable way to tackle climate change, you go renewables, you go energy efficiency. If the Tories want a really expensive way, you go fossil fuels and nuclear, and it wouldn't achieve it. So let's call the Tories out, not just on their failure to tackle climate change, not just on their failure to make our country more independent, but on their policies which would make people's heating bills and motoring costs go up even more.
Thanks very much, Ed. And that brings us to the end of the question and answer session. We are now out of time. So I'd like to say thank you very much to my aide, Belinda Brooks-Gordon, and to all of the questioners, of course, both people that submitted questions before and those that have asked questions on the chat. And finally, by no means least, to Sir Ed Davey himself. Thank you very much.
Hi, this is Cara Jenkinson, and I'm one of the vice chairs of the Liberal Democrat Federal Conference Committee. This autumn, we're really keen to encourage new voices at conference. If you've not spoken at a conference before, now might be the time to give it a go. There'll be debates across a wide range of topics, and we're keen to hear from people who may have direct experience of the issues being debated from their personal lives, or perhaps have professional expertise that they can add. The first step is to look at the conference agenda. Once you've decided on the debate that you would like to contribute to, make sure that you put in a speaker's card by 5 p.m. on the evening before the debate is due to happen. I call it a speaker's card, but actually it's now an electronic form which you can access via the conference website. You'll need to put in a bit of information about yourself, about what you'd like to say and what you'd add to the debate. You'll hear back the evening before the debate if you've been chosen to speak. The conference team will schedule a short technical check and will let you know how to join the debate. We've put together a few short tips on writing a great conference speech. Bex and Duncan are here to share them.
Everyone prepares for a conference speech slightly differently. However, the aim of this is to provide some general tips that can help you however you prepare. Firstly, some people will write out their whole speech and read it off, whereas others will read from bullet points. But regardless of which one of these you use, make sure that any facts you want to quote are accurately written down and clearly marked on your paper, underlined or highlighted if this will help you, because you want to be able to clearly and correctly quote them in your speech in order for them to give the most impact. Secondly, I always make sure I have at least one backup point, because you never know what the speaker before you was going to say. And if their whole speech is focused on one of the points you were going to make, it can be helpful to be not repeating that same point. And finally, 3 minutes isn't as long as you feel it's going to be. So don't try to fit 7 points into a 3-minute speech. You will either end up getting cut off halfway through, or you will be speaking so quickly that no one watching the debate will be able to understand the points you make. Pick the points you feel will fit best into the speech and focus on making them the best speech you can. Best of luck to all of you in your conference speeches in the future.
Hello, my name's Duncan Brack. I've been giving speeches at conference for more years than I care to remember. I've been asked to give you some tips on speaking at conference, so here they are. First, make sure you know how much time you've got. The maximum allowed lengths for speeches are printed in the conference agenda at the end of each motion. They're normally 3 minutes, unless you're giving the opening or closing speeches on motions or amendments. That means you can calculate how many words you can fit into your speech. An average person speaks at about 150 words a minute, but you might well want to go faster than that to give your speech pace and urgency, or sometimes slower, to emphasise your main points. But if you go too fast, your audience might not follow you, and if you go too slow, they might be bored. And if you run over your time, you risk being cut off by the conference chair. Either way, practice your speech in advance, record it and play it back to yourself to check whether it sounds okay and whether it fits into your time. Give a few speeches and you'll find the natural speed that works best for you. Second, write your speech out in the way you like. I write my speeches word for word, which makes it easy to time them, but it does risk making them sound a bit stilted, though I think I can usually avoid that. Many people prefer just writing down headings or brief notes or using cards rather than paper. Whatever you feel most comfortable with will work best for you. Third, be absolutely clear about what you're arguing for and what you want conference to do. If you want them to vote against the motion or for or against a particular bit of it, tell them that right at the start, explain why, and then tell them again at the end. Don't waste time introducing yourself or telling them your life story unless it's directly relevant to your argument. You're there to persuade them to vote the way you want them to, so be as clear as possible about why. Fourth, don't get worried if you get nervous in advance. Everyone does, no matter how experienced they are. Take your nervous energy and put it into your speech. Giving a speech at conference is challenging and nerve-wracking, but it teaches you to focus on what you really believe and what you really think about the motion that's being discussed, and it gives you a real adrenaline buzz. So my final tip is, enjoy yourself.
We usually do our party awards at the end of conference, so I should perhaps reassure you, you haven't fallen asleep, it's not Sunday evening, but it is party awards time, our time to thank and celebrate some of our most wonderful colleagues. But before we get to the 4 scheduled awards, we've got a special memorial award to honour 2 party members, neither elected to public office themselves, but who helped so many others get elected and who have both sadly passed away since we last met, Andrew McLean and Erland Watson. Now, as well as a distinguished career, including a, necessarily because of the Official Secrets Act, somewhat secretive submarine journey to the Caribbean, Andrew was the most important volunteer we've ever had working on data. Building tools, tidying up data, sourcing new information, Andrew worked tirelessly behind the scenes, helping others win, and being a lovely person all the way through. Thank you, Andrew, so much for everything you've done. And now let's hear from his mother, Melinda.
Andrew's brother and I were deeply touched when we were told he was to be honoured at conference. Andrew was a dedicated Liberal Democrat, and his involvement with the party was an important part of his life. He never looked for recognition, but it is gratifying that his contribution has been publicly recognised. Mark was generous and kind when he spoke about Andrew in his blog, when he wrote a letter of condolence, and when he spoke at Andrew's funeral. We appreciate that. Callum and I knew how much of himself he gave to the furtherance of the party's objectives. His contribution to the party's data management gave him a lot of satisfaction, and it is good to know that it will live on.
Alongside Andrew, we honour and mourn the passing of Erland Watson. Like Andrew, a lovely person who worked tirelessly to help others. I used to joke there's a really simple test of whether someone was a party activist to ask them simply, who is Erland Watson? Because Erland seemed to be ever present, helping in campaigns and helping people all across the country. As Alistair Carmichael said of him, look up the word stalwart in the dictionary and you will find a picture of Erland. Eccentric, generous, knowledgeable, helpful, lovely. We miss you so much, Erland. And now we'll hear from his sister, Ingrid Mary.
Thank you so much for allowing me to come along and say a few words just to thank the Liberal Democrats for honouring Erland. He was just an absolute Liberal stalwart, really. I think he saw an awful lot more of Lib Dems than he did even of his family when it came down to it. But what I remember of him was my big brother, the Liberal Democrat, just from when I was very young. And it was just such an immense part of his life. So what I think was really heartening for him was in those final months of his life, after he became so very unwell with his transplant, the number of people that spoke out about his contribution and how he had become a friend to them through the Liberal Democrats and how he'd supported them in the party. And as such, I think that warmth and that friendship from the party and everybody within it and the connections he'd made with them, they really carried him through the last year of his life when things were very challenging at times. And as a family, it really was incredibly comforting to know that the party and all the members of the party that he reached out and touched were there for him in body sometimes over the past week while looking after him as he became more frail, but certainly in spirit behind him all the way as he went through that very difficult journey at the end of his life. So yes, thank you all for giving him this honour, even if it was posthumously. It would be lovely if he was listening in to know that he's been given this honour, but one way or another, it's a very moving thing to have been given to him.
Our love and condolences are with both of you and your families, Melinda and Ingrid Mary. Next, we have the Leaders Award, and who better to announce the winner than our leader himself, Ed Davey.
I'm absolutely delighted to announce the winner of this year's Leaders Award. This person always leads by the example of his own hard work, no matter how unglamorous the task. As chair and then vice chair for the North Shropshire Liberal Democrats, his leadership has been instrumental in so many of our recent successes there, for our strong showing in the Shropshire Council elections to our stunning by-election victory in December. Simply put, we would not have won North Shropshire without his leadership. He worked tirelessly to coordinate with Helen, the local party and federal campaigners, and he could always be counted on to make sure things got done during the by-election, whether it was heavy lifting or endless deliveries, right down to clearing up the HQ afterwards and removing all those staples. It is, of course, the wonderful Dave Walker. Dave's passion and dedication to the Liberal Democrats is so inspiring, and it was a pleasure to watch him at work on the campaign trail. We need more Dave Walkers in our party. So congratulations, Dave, on this well-deserved win. And a heartfelt thank you on behalf of myself, Helen, and the whole party for everything you have done.
Thank you very much. To win this award is humbling and very special. Thank you to everybody who contributed to Helen's victory. I'm still pinching myself. They have such a fantastic Lib Dem MP. We can all be very proud of what we've achieved. Good luck to everybody next May. Where we work hard, we win is a truism, but that is even more true now. Believe in yourselves and special things will happen. So go and kick ass. Thank you very much.
Next, we have the Bertha Bowness Fisher Award, named after the first ever formally qualified female Liberal election agent who was profiled recently by the Lib Dem History Group in their journal. She was an amazing person, and this award honours a recently joined party member. The winner this time is someone who joined the party only in November in Leeds, but got right into the action, immediately travelling repeatedly over to North Shropshire to help and being a wonderful, energising presence on the doorstep. So many congratulations to this year's winner, Noah Allerton.
I'm honoured to be receiving the Bertha Bowness Fisher Award today, so thank you everyone so much. However, I would also like to thank everyone who's made me feel so welcome so far in the party. I've only been in the party for a short amount of time, but everyone I've met both on the ground or online has been so welcoming. I can't thank you everyone enough for all of that. I've had a great first few moments in the Liberal Democrats, and I can't wait for everything that is to come. Thank you again so much for this award.
Next is the Albert Ingham Award for a brilliant campaign mastermind. This year's winner agented a recent by-election win, but not just any old win, one against Labour in Northern England with an amazing 26% swing. So the brilliantly organised campaign, a wonderful candidate and team, getting Alan Good elected, pulling the agenting strings behind all of that was this time's winner, Charles Glover.
I'm grateful to accept the Albert Ingham Award on behalf of my wonderful campaign team here in Ancoats and Beswick. It's great that you're recognising what we've achieved here in the by-election in February. We beat Labour by gaining over 50% of the vote and a swing bigger than Chesham and Amersham. If we can win in urban Remain Ancoats, which was ignored by Labour, and inner city working class leave voting Beswick, which was neglected by Labour, we can win anywhere in the country. Let's keep beating Labour. Thank you. Thank you.
Finally, we have the Laura Grimmond Award, named after someone who, as The Independent put it, was dedicated to promoting political pluralism without seeking publicity for herself. She reminds us that some of the most crucial work from some of the best of our colleagues happens behind the scenes, out of the limelight. And so, to tell us this year's winner, let's head over to Scotland to hear from our Scottish convener, Jenny Lang.
So, I'm Jenny Lang, I'm the convener of the Scottish Party, for those of you who don't know me, and I am delighted to be able to recognise Megan Wiseman, who has won the Laura Grimmond Award, which is incredibly fitting for a member of the Scottish Liberal Democrats. Megan is the absolute engine room behind the Scottish Party. Without her, frankly, we couldn't function, and we probably wouldn't even be legal half the time. She is just amazing. There's the stuff that our members can see on a day-to-day basis, whether that is the person who answers the phone, who answers their emails, who supports our local parties to get their Zoom meetings up and running, who helps them with their candidate selections and getting their paperwork filled in properly. But then there's also the huge power of work that people don't always see. Putting together 2 conferences a year, almost entirely single-handedly, managing the accounts of the party, going through the audit process for us, but also the amount of work that she puts in during an election time. She is absolutely incredible. We couldn't function without her. I'm just so delighted that she's won this award. And Megan, I look forward to celebrating with you very, very soon. Congratulations.
Congratulations, Megan. And that's the wrap on this spring's awards. Congratulations to the winners. Thank you to everyone who nominated them and others that made these awards such a tough selection. And the very best of luck to everyone in all of your efforts until our next awards. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Conference, and good afternoon. Just from the Federal Conference Committee, obviously a huge congratulations to Dave, Noah, Charles and Megan, and we certainly hope that at our next conference in autumn we'll have an in-person opportunity to remember the massive contributions that Ellen and Andrew have made to our party. Moving on, we now come to F20, which is the revised election regulations. You'll notice when it comes to the vote that the choice is to ratify or not to ratify. Election regulations are not subject to amendment or separate vote requests. With that in mind, could I please ask Lawrence Cox to stand by, and I call Duncan Brack from Lambeth to move the election regulations. Duncan.
Thanks very much, Nick. So this isn't the most exciting item on the agenda, but it is quite important. Because some of you may remember, back in November 2019, a bit of a problem the party experienced with the federal committee elections that were then underway. Shortly after voting started, it was discovered that a number of candidates' manifestos had not been linked from their names on the online ballot papers. Given the clear likelihood of missing manifestos affecting voters' behaviour when they decide who to vote for, the returning officer team decided to cancel those votes that had been cast and restart the election once the links had been reinstated. Now, as you might remember, voting for our federal committees can take quite a while. In 2019, a total of 109 candidates stood for 4 different committees. So given that we ended up asking about 5,000 voters to cast their votes again, there must be a fair chance that some of them never actually got around to it. This is particularly likely given the fact that the 2019 general election was called the next day. Having said that, I think it was the right decision. The other options that the returning officer team thought about were even less attractive. After the elections were out of the way, I was asked by the federal board to review the committee elections, identify what had gone wrong and produce recommendations for reform. And these revised election regulations in F20 on pages 49 to 58 of the agenda are the result. I want to thank the small group of party members who helped me in the exercise, which included reviewing the election systems of other organisations to see whether there are any lessons to be learned for us, those party staff I interviewed, and everyone who responded to the 2 short consultations we carried out in 2020. Although I was initially appointed to review the committee election regulations, it soon became clear that it would make sense to review the other election regulations for internal party positions, those for the leader, the president, and the vice president responsible for working with ethnic minority communities. All of these sets of regulations overlapped to a significant degree, but since they had originally been written separately, they all tended to have slightly different arrangements for the same things, like deadlines for the receipt of nominations or the dispatch of ballot papers and so on. So one major achievement of these regulations, which cover all these posts, is to simplify them and make them more consistent. It was also the fact that the original 3 sets of regulations had been written in an era before online voting and then amended piecemeal and not always consistently to deal with this more recent innovation. The revised regulations treat online voting as the norm, while preserving the right of party members to vote by paper if they so choose. The most significant innovation included here is to scrap the previous setup in which the chair of the appeals panel was the returning officer, regardless of any expertise they may have had or not had in running elections. Now, in practice, the administration of the elections was always carried out by party staff, and although for some periods of time there was considerable consistency in the individuals involved, that's never guaranteed. Many of the problems experienced in 2019 were due to the fact that inexperienced party staff, with no written guidance in place, were trying to make an internal party election work while facing considerable pressure preparing for a general election that everyone knew then was imminent. So in these revised regulations, we've replaced this setup with a returning officer appointed by the federal board from amongst the party membership for a period of 3 years, which can be renewable. The party has many individuals experienced in running internal elections, and that would be an excellent background for the post. Together with the chief executive, this individual will appoint a team to work with them, including not just party staff, but also other party members with relevant experience. Alongside the preparation of written procedures and guidelines, which party staff have been putting in place since 2019, this should bring experience, stability, and continuity to the running of our internal party elections. We've also taken the opportunity to introduce 1 or 2 other innovations, like allowing the returning officer, if they so choose, to specify questions that candidates for a particular post must answer, alongside their personal manifestos. The aim is to help focus candidates' minds on what they want to do on the committees they're standing for, instead of, or as well as, telling everyone how wonderful they are. But mostly, these revised election regulations are about rationalising, tidying up, and making the entire process run more smoothly. Please vote for F20. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Duncan. Could I please ask Mark Pack to stand by, and I now call Lawrence Cox from Harrow Borough to speak against the regulations.
Thank you. I should say that I agree with everything that Duncan has just said, and that having worked with him, I know what a good job he's done. But there is just one area I have a concern about, and this is paragraphs 22 to 24 of the election regulations. And that is because they do not recognise the collateral damage that repeated appeals cause. We all know our new Vice President, Amna Ahmad, took up her post in the middle of February. And that was a delay of 2 months caused as a result of an appeal. We don't know who by or who against, but it was sufficient to prevent the cause the returning officer not to announce the result of the election as soon as it was known. And that's by far from the only occurrence. I know that the London Region Chair was not installed until October 2021, despite being elected the previous autumn. And there's also been similar delays with the English Council elections of last year. Now, I think this is a serious problem, and it's not one that's addressed in the election regulations. Now, clearly, a single appeal against the result of the election must be allowed, but multiple appeals create this collateral damage of people not being able to take their post without necessarily meeting the high bar of being both repeated and vexatious. At the same time, the consultation of the returning officer with the returning officer team, which takes place behind closed doors, is opaque. So what I'd like to suggest to the federal board is that they instruct the returning officer team in consultation with the returning officers to develop guidance to returning officers to be approved and published by the federal board, and that no appeal should be allowed to a returning officer's decision unless that decision conflicts with the guidelines or is on a point not covered by the guidelines. Now, in public elections, the Electoral Commission provides published guidance to returning officers, and I think we should do likewise for our internal elections. Lastly, While paragraph 25 allows review of these regulations, this only covers future elections, and I would request that it should be extended to cover issues that have arisen from elections in the recent past as well. We don't want candidates this autumn to suffer in the same way that candidates have in the past, and Federal Board has the opportunity to put this right by modifying these election rules at autumn conference. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lawrence. Could I now call Dr. Mark Pack, Party President, to summate on the revised election regulations? Mark.
Thank you. As Duncan said in moving this motion, these regulations are designed to be simpler, clearer and more robust. And they're based on the review that Duncan, with the help of others, kindly carried out. But I'm sure those others won't mind me saying that Duncan did the huge weight of that work. So I really wanted to firstly publicly thank Duncan for his willingness to take on that task. It's hugely appreciated. Turning to Lawrence's points, I absolutely agree with you, Lawrence, that it is a problem how long it can be between the close of voting in an election and the results coming out in one of our internal elections. The two of the examples that Lawrence mentioned are elections that are run and administered under the English party's rules and by the English party. So that those issues are not addressed directly by the federal party, because it wouldn't be appropriate for us to intrude on the English party and be trying to order a state party as to how to run its elections. But definitely there's also, as Lawrence mentioned, been a similar issue with a federal party election. So there are three things these rules do to address that. One is they have a shorter appeal timescale, still a reasonable timescale for making an appeal, but a shorter one than the timescale that used to be in place that was very generous and, as Duncan mentioned, essentially based on a world where people had to wait for letters to be posted back and forth rather than our ability to do stuff online. Secondly, what these new regulations do is they make clear that, as in public elections, there is the opportunity for the returning officer to declare the result, and then subsequently somebody can still lodge an appeal against the result, just as you have, say, in a general election, an MP declare elected, and then an election petition might be filed subsequently. But crucially, that election petition doesn't stop the MP taking up their post. And similarly, when we have a result declared, we therefore can have somebody take up their post without having to wait for every possible appeal, reappeal, etc., necessarily to have been resolved. And I think that's really important, because we do need people to be able to take up their post after an election is concluded, because otherwise members are losing their democratic right to elect somebody to fill that post. I noticed with interest Lawrence's additional suggestion about some published guidance. I think it should be for the returning officer to independently decide what they think is right in that area rather than for the board to instruct them. But I'm very happy to commit to writing to the returning officer when one is appointed to put Lawrence's suggestions to them, and obviously to make sure through some route that we report back on that. And I hope that with that, I should just add, when eventually there is hopefully a resolution of the final outstanding appeal from the vice president's election, what we have said at the board is we will do the review that we're required to do after each round of elections. We will do a mini version of that after that conclusion of that, because I think we need to see what any final lessons might be from that. So I hope between that promised additional review, raising the issues with the returning officer, and the changes that are in the rules already to try and address the problems that Lawrence mentioned, that both Lawrence and everyone else will be happy to vote for these election regulations. And therefore that would mean the board can get on with advertising for a new returning officer, and they can then get in post in good time ahead of the big set of elections we've got coming up this autumn. So I very much hope that Lawrence and everyone else will feel happy to vote for this motion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mark. Okay, we will now come on to a vote on the F20 revised election regulations. And the vote is to ratify or not to ratify. And the voting is live now, hopefully. Thank you very much for that, conference. So we have 135 votes to ratify and 7 votes against ratification of the regulations. So the revised election regulations have passed. I'd like to thank my aide, Joe Otten, and my voting aide, Chris Adams. And we will now be moving into an auditorium break. And there is a cornucopia of different events and fringes to attend. For example, the Federal Policy Committee Fairer Society consultation, Green Lib Dems on energy security, electoral reform and PR, the LGA, ALDC and York Lib Dems about the local race to net zero, spokesperson Q&A for DEFRA, and lots of other things to do as well. So please go off and enjoy the break. Do attend the exhibition and the fringes. And we look forward to seeing you back in the studio at 6:45 when we will be debating, I've just lost my page, fixing the ambulance crisis. Thank you very much, conference.